Um, so in the 1800s, while enslaved in South Carolina, a man known as Dave the Potter worked as an artisan, creating soft stoneware vessels for food storage. He inscribed his name, dates, and poetic verses unto this work, an act of resistance at a time when it was a crime for him to read and write. And this was written by a New York Times writer in a recently published article. Well, not recently, it was in October. So good evening and welcome. My name is Rashana Moore Evans, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening at King's Chapel for this important conversation, Returning the Art. Tonight, we're not just talking about art, we're talking about legacy, responsibility, and what it means to restore in a multidimensional way what was taken from David Drake and his descendants. This conversation sits at the intersection of history, ethics, and justice. It asks us to consider not only what it means to preserve art, but what it means to return it, to restore not just objects, but connection, dignity, and legacy. At the center of our conversation is David Drake, an enslaved master potter who, in defiance of laws that criminalize literacy, inscribed his name and words into clay. His work has survived for nearly 2 centuries. It did more than last, it outlived the very conditions meant to erase him. And yet, for much of that time, his descendants were separated from both his legacy and the value it generated. The recent return of his pottery from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to his descendants represents a historic moment, one that challenges longstanding assumptions about ownership, stewardship, and accountability. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from 2 individuals who helped make the return possible: Victoria Reed, Bettina Bird Chair for Provenance at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and George Fothery, founder and CEO of Oral Impact. Together, their work reflects what becomes possible when institutions, legal advocates, and communities engage seriously in the work of repair. And I hope tonight's conversation invites all of us to think more deeply about what role we each can play in truth-telling, repair, and reconciliation. So let's begin. I want to introduce George and Victoria, or as we affectionately know her as Tori Reed. So can you each share a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved in the work around David Drake? So I'm just going to start off with George.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for joining this important conversation. Really appreciate the King's Chapel community extending this invitation. My name is George Fothery. I am an attorney by training, although I am no longer primarily involved in the practice of law. I went to school close to where you all are. I studied at Harvard and graduated in the late 90s. When I graduated, I worked in the private sector as a consultant, as an entrepreneur, and eventually made a pivot and left the private sector and returned to California to work in public education reform. At the same time that I left the private sector to work in public education reform, I decided to do something that I told myself I would never do, and that is I went to law school. Had no idea what I wanted to be grown up. The only thing I was sure of was that I never wanted to be a lawyer. But in the first part of my career, I had the opportunity to work and interact with lawyers, and I never wanted to practice law, but I admired the skills that they had. I liked how when they communicated, people listened, much how you're all listening right now. And I liked how when they talked through stuff, it was like you could follow it and it was analytical. So, anyways, I decided to go back to law school. The only problem was I was married, I had a mortgage, I had an infant son, and I had a baby on the way and a full-time job. So I went to law school at night. And I figured, hey, I don't really want to practice. I just want to get the law degree. So I went to law school at night. Um, and two crazy things happened. And the first is I fell in love with law school. And the second is I ended up doing pretty well. And so when I graduated, the advice I got from the dean was, look, I know you don't want to be a lawyer, but you ought to go and practice somewhere, even if it's just for a couple of years, so that people will take you seriously as an attorney. And I remember I asked him, I said, well, where do you think I should go? And he goes, that's easy. If you only want to do this for 2 years, go to a firm called Skadden. which is a New York-based Wall Street law firm, and go to Skadden, because 2 years at Skadden will be like 4 or 5 years anywhere else. They're just going to work they're going to work you to death basically. And so that's what I did. I graduated. I spent a year clerking for a judge on the Ninth Circuit, and then I went to join Big Law. My plan was to do it just for 2 years, right? Just to kind of get it on my resume and build some additional skills, and then get back to the impact work that I was doing. And that 2 years turned into almost 2 decades. And I think what changed is I figured out really early on that Big Law was, and I think is, or can be, a great platform to advance a lot of the stuff that was really important to me and my family, if you're so inclined. And so, working as an attorney at Skadden, I was able to do pro bono work. I was able to serve on nonprofit boards. I got the firm to staff teams of lawyers. I got the firm to write checks. And so it was kind of this surprise where I was, doing work that I found interesting. I was learning a lot, but I was also getting to support institutions and causes that were important to me and my family. I'll mention just a couple of other things that I think are relevant to bringing us to this conversation, and that is, the first is I became a real estate attorney, which, if you knew anything about how I grew up, that really makes no sense for me to become a real estate lawyer. Like, nobody in my family had ever had property. I really didn't care about that, but through a series of circumstances, I became a real estate attorney. That eventually led itself to an art law practice. So I also practice art law. The very first pro bono case that I ever worked on involved petitioning the German government for a pension for a couple that were in their 90s who had been interned during the Holocaust. And again, if you knew anything about kind of my background and where I grew up, that didn't make a ton of sense that would be my first pro bono case. But I mentioned those things, the real estate law and the working with the Holocaust survivors for reparations, because probably my biggest break as an attorney came in 2019, when I started representing the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce in a project here in Southern California called Bruce's Beach. And this is not what this talk is about, so I won't go into detail on Bruce's Beach, but if you're interested, you can Google it. There's lots of information out there. Bruce's Beach ended up being the first time in our country's history that the government returned land to an African American family after the land had been taken in a racially motivated eminent domain action a century earlier. This is a family who, in the early 1900s, bought beachfront property and built a thriving, successful hotel and resort that catered to Black beachgoers, and the city took it. So, anyways, in 2019, I think because I was a real estate attorney and because I had this reparations experience, ended up representing that family, represented them for 3 years. That culminated in 2022 in the return. LA County returned that property to the Bruce family, and that's starting to bring us full circle to why we are here today, because in the aftermath of that, I received hundreds of phone calls from families across the country, mostly Black, but not all Black, looking for legal help to get land returned. And I realized that our legal system, really didn't provide any remedy in most of those cases. In fact, I remember saying that to somebody. I said, sir, I'm sorry, but I don't believe our legal system provides an adequate remedy to you for that loss. And I remember he said, yeah, he goes, I guess our legal system's broken. And when he said those words, I thought to myself, our legal system's not broken. Our legal system works precisely the way it was designed to work by and for the people who designed it. And that's just not me and you. Our legal system works perfectly. And that's the reason why you'll never get the land back. So anyways, I received hundreds of those phone calls. I ended up starting a nonprofit called the Black Land Loss Narrative Archive Project, which is an effort to collect, preserve, and amplify stories of Black land loss. But there was one phone call I got that was not related to Black land loss. It was related to art. And I got a phone call from members of David Drake's family. And I had never heard of David Drake. I didn't know who he was. But after doing some research and understanding the situation, I agreed to work with the family and see if we could figure out a way so that David Drake's descendants could be among the beneficiaries of his life and legacy and practice. So that's probably a little bit more than a short introduction in my bio.
Thank you so much, George. Really appreciate that. Tori, you're up.
Yeah, it's really nice to see everyone, and I realize that most people at King's Chapel don't actually really know very much about what I do. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what my job is. I have to take myself off speaker view because I'm sorry, it's very weird. Like, I'm gonna put up some slides so that people have something nice to look at while I'm speaking. Um, Otherwise, you're looking at me. Um, So my job is curator for provenance at the MFA, and I've been at the MFA since 2003. And when I tell people what I do, most people don't actually know what provenance means. They think it means like authenticity or that I deal with fakes and forgeries, and that's not really what provenance is. Provenance is the history of ownership of a work of art, basically like a work of art's biography from the time of its creation to the present. And my full-time job since 2001, I've been at the MFA since 2003, but my full-time job for pretty much my entire adult life has been to research the history of ownership of works of art, which sounds sort of arcane and like how is that a career? And I think for most of the 20th century, it wouldn't have been a career. And there was very much a kind of finders keepers attitude in museums and on the market. But all of that changed in the late 90s when there was an international gathering in Washington, D.C. called the Washington Conference on Holocaust Era Assets. And that was a kind of pivotal moment. There were 44 countries that gathered and pledged to, among other things, identify works of art within their geographical boundaries that had been looted during the Nazi era or World War II era and not returned. And it's up to each country to determine how best they're going to do that. And if they do find looted art, then they are supposed to facilitate what's known as a just and fair solution. And so this was 1998. And so all of a sudden, American museums were tasked with, through our museum guidelines, tasked with researching our collections and trying to recreate chains of ownership that had long since been forgotten or erased or lost, and going into a kind of detail that museums really hadn't had to do before. Right up until that point, provenance was kind of like a laundry list of prestigious names. And so everything kind of changed overnight because you also have in the late 90s the rise of the internet. And so museums are being tasked with doing this research at a time when they also suddenly have a new means of sharing provenance information with everybody, with the public, with museum goers. So provenance becomes democratized, and museums, as they start to share this information, become accountable to their audiences, I think, in new ways. And so I started doing provenance research at about that time, in about 2001. And the whole impetus for this was to find potentially Nazi looted art. And that's a kind of broad umbrella term that encompasses many different sort of categories of World War II era thefts. And to facilitate solutions if you find it, if you discover it, if you research it and you find it in your collection. I came to the MFA in 2003 and pretty quickly had to hit the ground running. I'd never dealt with a restitution claim before. The day that I came to the MFA in August of 2003, curator came and like whomp, like this huge claim file on my desk. So I had to learn kind of on the job what this was about. But I think collectively as a field, we all had to learn what this was about because nobody had really done it before. And so my career, what I think I've witnessed is really the evolution of collecting ethics from that moment on. Like it started with Nazi looted art. But within a few years, the museum was dealing with claims for antiquities and archaeological materials that had been plundered from sites in countries like Italy and Turkey. And so, after a decade at the MFA, my job had really shifted, and I had gone from working on Nazi era provenance research to being in a centralized position and working on ownership claims of all kinds and with every department in the museum. And I think that's what's really important, because my role is to make sure that each department at the Museum of Fine Arts, and we're an encyclopedic museum, we have over 500,000 works of art from all over the world. I have to make sure that everybody is adhering to a consistent standard in their collecting. And as we bring new works of art into the collection, make sure that everybody is answering the same questions and answering those questions at the same level of detail and accountability. Otherwise, you have, one department collecting looted art and another department not collecting looted art. I mean, that would be the two extremes. And as collecting ethics have evolved, we're really not looking at the letter of the law. The law is the minimum standard. Everybody has to obey the law. Museums are public educational institutions. We're nonprofits. And so it is very reasonable to expect museums to go beyond the letter of the law and to uphold a high ethical standard in collecting. And that's what the MFA has really tried to do over the last 20, 30 years. It's funny, if you go back and you read like Boston Globe headlines from the late 90s, the MFA was absolutely the poster child for bad behavior. There was like headlines every week from the Spotlight team about, allegations of looted art, Nazi looted art, Guatemalan antiquities, African antiquities. And the attitude of the museum at that time was very defensive. It was kind of like, it's none of your business. Like, these are rightfully ours, just like absolutely the wrong answer from a PR point of view. And we have really turned that around and have tried to be really transparent and really proactive in sharing information and in redressing claims. And so I can talk a little bit later on about what some of those claims look like, but all of this to say that at this point, 2026, we're not just dealing with Holocaust era and antiquities. We're also thinking about more ethical issues like works of art taken under periods of colonialism and colonial rule. And actually, I do have a screenshot of our web page, but my slides aren't advancing. So in any event, we're dealing more with ethical issues right now, and thinking about works of art that were wrongfully taken from individuals or communities or countries, where there might not have been legislation that governed how that cultural property would have moved at the time. But we can tell that it was a theft, or it was a de facto theft. And so all of this leads up to the exhibition Hear Me Now, which is how I got involved in this process. This was an exhibition that started at the Met. It was organized by the Met, the MFA, and colleagues at Michigan, the University of Michigan Art Museum, and my colleague Ethan Lasser, who's the curator at the MFA, came to me about David Drake and about ownership issues, and to his credit, because this was something that the curatorial team had been thinking about, that I think they wanted to do something. They had engaged the descendants of David Drake, I think, at that point, or were involving them in the conversations as they were planning the exhibition. And they didn't want to have this exhibition and not have some kind of resolution or agreement, something sort of tangible come out of it. And so then they brought me into their curatorial discussions. And that is how I got involved. And I feel like I've been talking forever, so I'll stop and we can go on to the next question.
So you're going to continue to talk, because I have another question for you that I think
Yes.
is going to get us to where you were trying to lead us. So one of the things that can get lost is how something like this actually happens, right? How do you return art? What it takes to move from possibility to reality. So Tori, tell me a little bit more about the museum's perspective of how what is required internally to move this work forward? And in what ways is this case consistent with other examples of restitution, which you talked about a little bit there, and in what ways is
Yes.
it different?
Yeah. So I got my slides moving now. So how did this start? So Ethan came to me with this particular problem. I guess I'm going to answer this question in two different ways. First of all, Ethan came to me with this problem, and I started to think about, really the rightful ownership of these vessels was kind of the elephant in the room, because the artist had obviously never been paid. He'd never gotten any kind of remuneration for his work on these vessels that he conceptualized and created under, for lack of a better term, duress conditions. And so I started to think about it, and I talked to some of my colleagues in the field, and I remember talking to some people who were in the art law field, and the one response I got that really struck me was from someone who said, well, the pyramids were made with slave labor too, so we can't undo and redress all instances of slave labor in history. And I was like, well, I had to think about that for a second, and I was like, this is not in any way comparable, actually, to the pyramids or to the White House or whatever example you wanted to pull, because those are instances really of slave labor. What we are looking at here are works of fine art. And if we bring these vessels into the Museum of Fine Arts and we put them on display in an exhibition and we put them under vitrines and we have labels that credit David Drake as the artist, then we are acknowledging right then and there that these represent more than labor. That we are putting them absolutely on par with everything else that's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts. And in my work on Holocaust era assets, we've done a lot with, do you have these? With works of art, not just that the Nazis like literally plundered or that were taken during periods of conflict, but works of art that Jewish collectors had to give up because of racial persecution. And there's often a lot of gray areas in these cases. There are works of art that people had to abandon. They might have had to sell because they had no other means of subsistence. It's not like the Nazis always came in and put a gun to someone's head to force them to sell. They might have been trying to escape. They might have sold their belongings to friends. But these were not transactions that were done freely. We try to think, would these have taken place if the Nazis hadn't been in power? And did people have a choice? And did people receive money that they could actually use? Or were they using funds to escape or to pay, persecutory fines and taxes? And if that's the kind of money they received, then it's really not a free and fair transaction. And I also started thinking, as I often do, about our provenance records, because we have the provenance of all of our works of art online, and how often our provenance statements begin with the artist. And you can see some examples here. And this was actually kind of getting on my nerves with my colleagues, because I was like, if you start every single provenance record with the artist, then it doesn't really mean anything anymore. We all know that the artist was the first owner, right? Like, it's just taken for granted. And even if it was a commission, as our director or wasn't director at the time, our now director was like, well, but they didn't own if it was a commission. I said, right, but even if it was a commission, the artist had the agency to decide whether or not to accept the commission and for what kind of remuneration, or if they wanted to trade it, what the conditions were. And in this case, the artist, the de facto first owner of these works of art, had no agency. And so in that way, it is actually directly comparable to works of art that changed hands under duress during the Holocaust. There's not just duress conditions, but there's no agency, certainly no money changing hands, and therefore we would consider this a kind of de facto theft, right? This was wrongfully taken from the first owner. And so before we did anything, Ethan and I changed the online provenance for our vessels. And you can see that before the show, the provenance records started like with the vessel's appearance on the market. in recent years, Tony Schenck in South Carolina. But we know exactly where the chain of ownership begins. We knew that these were created in 1857, and we know exactly how they changed hands in 1857, and they were sold to benefit David Drake's enslaver. And we thought that was very important. Whatever the outcome of the exhibition and any conversations were going to be, we wanted to put that out there as sort of factual information. And during the run of the show, I also wrote a label drawing these comparisons. Again, not drawing any conclusions, but we really wanted to raise the questions. If we're doing this in one area of our collection, if we're doing this with European paintings and decorative arts, why are we not doing it here? Like, what is the difference? And if there had been an artist who was in a concentration camp and, was created a work of art there and was, of course, forced to give it up, and it was today in the Museum of Fine Arts, I don't think anyone would think twice about whether or not we should deaccession and give it back. So regardless of what was going to happen, I think it was important to draw those parallels so that we as an institution were being consistent in how we upheld our values and how we upheld our collecting policy. And so that was my thinking as we started to go into the conversations with George, which I think were after the close of the show, maybe in 2024. He might remember better than me. And that was what guided our internal thought process. And that consistency is really important when you get up in front of the Board of Trustees and say, we want to deaccession this because we believe it was stolen. They're going to say, why? They're going to say, we've never heard of this before. This is a new issue. What are you doing? My job is to say, no, in fact, like, this particular iteration is new, but we've done this before many times. Like, you've heard of restitution before, and you've heard of Nazi era restitution before, and you've heard of duress sales. And this is entirely consistent with what we've done. And when we voted to deaccession the vessels, the board was absolutely unanimous, which made us all very happy, I think.
Awesome. I don't know if you want to continue to share the slides.
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's see. Go back to. So this was the show at the MFA. And this is one of David Drake's jars. He would inscribe poetry on them. Again, I don't feel like I think maybe George should speak to his work more than I should, but this one is just like really, it's really a moving inscription, and it kind of epitomizes perhaps the I don't want to say the career, that's like art history talk, but it really sort of sums up the whole situation, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tori. Do you want to pull down your slides, unless, George, you think these slides would be helpful for you?
She can pull it down, but Tori, I encourage you. I think you should speak to. I'd love for you to speak to the importance and significance of the poetry, but in particular this verse.
Okay. I mean, so when we had the show, I think it was really a division of labor, and Ethan is really the expert on David Drake's creations. But these are kind of monumental stoneware jars, and you can see they've got these like beautiful sort of drips of alkaline glaze, and then we have these really tremendous inscriptions. And so David Drake not only inscribed his vessels with poetry, but he very often signed and dated his works. And I think the other thing to keep in mind that's really important as we think about these things as works of fine art is that no one was forcing him to write poems on these jars, right? And that's really one of the things that transforms them into works of fine art. So I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all in every nation. The poem that is on the MFA's jar is really an ironic kind of couple of lines.
Yeah.
I made this jar for cash, though it's called lucre trash. And lucre is, of course, money that's made through sort of ill-gotten means. So yes, I think in some ways it's kind of perfect that was the jar that we the museum purchased back. So the resolution that we ultimately reached was that we deaccessioned both of these vessels. These are both in our collection, both 1857. We deaccessioned both of them, and that's a process by which we formally removed something from the museum collection. We transferred ownership to David Drake's descendants, and we purchased the larger one with the poem back. So particularly it didn't actually move from the galleries, but legal ownership did change and then came back to the museum. Didn't revert to the museum. We actually bought it back. It got a new accession number. It got a new credit line. So we went through the whole formal process of giving it back and reaccessioning it, which is not something we normally do.
Awesome. Yeah, I thought.
I was just going to add, in addition to getting a new accession number, when the museum acquired the jar back from Drake's descendants, Drake's family also provided the museum with a document that's called a certificate of ethical ownership. And the idea here is to distinguish between this jar that is now legitimately and ethically owned by the Museum of Fine Art Boston and other jars which are possessed, and I use that term intentionally. I don't say owned, I say possessed or held, other jars that are possessed and held in other institutions around the country where there's not this certificate of ethical ownership with and that's not a concept that existed prior to this transaction with the museum in Boston, but the family wanted to in a sense indicate that there are now two markets for David Drake's artwork. There's a legitimate and an ethical market where the artwork has been acquired, obviously not from the artist because we can't do that, but the next best option is the artwork has been acquired through his descendants. And there's also in the family's view, an illegitimate and an unethical market for his artworks, and those are artworks that have been acquired without any engagement of Drake or his descendants.
George, what made you approach the Museum of Fine Arts first, or what were they the first institution that you approached, and how did you approach them?
Yeah, so there's probably 24 institutions in the U.S. that, again, possess or hold David Drake's artwork, and what I'll say is. This is as a lawyer, we tend to rely a lot on precedent, right? Which is basically, how did they do it last time? As Tori's pointed out, ethical restitution of artwork is not new. There's been a movement going on 30 years, but principles of ethical restitution had never been applied to artworks created by enslaved African Americans. And so in that sense, there really was no precedent for this. It was important. I knew that we had to get this right. And I knew that there were some issues that we could draw parallels and we could say, look, this is similar to what you've done here with Nazi looted art. But there were some issues that were issues of first impression, like the concept that Tori mentioned of this is not just, you could argue that this is not just stolen art, but it's also stolen labor. And what are the implications of that? And so the point is, this had never been done before. And if I was going to be involved with this, I really wanted to get it right. And at the same time, I've got to I've got a big enough ego and enough confidence to think that, hey, I can get this done. But at the same time, I've actually got enough, I think, self-awareness and humility in recognizing that if we're going to do this, we should get the best minds from the art and academic community to be part of this. And so the reason that we started with Boston is on this Zoom call with us, and it's Victoria Reed. When you look at leading voices, in the country and frankly in the world around ethical restitution and this kind of this moral, I don't know if you call it moral obligation or moral opportunity. Um, Tori's a leading voice there. I think the Museum of Fine Art Boston also had a distinguished record with ethical restitution, and that's not by coincidence. It's because Tori is there, and so I think when I agreed to undertake this work, I knew it was very important to get it right. I knew that there were kind of brighter and more experienced, minds out there than mine, and I wanted them to be the thought partners. Even though, let's be clear, like Tori and I were on, opposing sides of this transaction, but that's never, mattered to me. I really wanted to come up with a structure that was thoughtful and that would be durable, and that hopefully would be replicable. And so I would say as much as anything, it was her presence at the museum's track record. The second part of your question was, how did we approach the museum? And maybe I should have been explicit with this when I was introduced myself, but I mentioned I'm a real estate attorney. I've got an art law practice. I'm not a litigator. I don't sue people. I don't go into court. I've been in a court, maybe once or twice, and one of those was a speeding ticket. And so my approach to the museum was literally an invitation, and we wanted to invite the museum to be partners in doing something that was, bold and courageous and trailblazing and and full of moral and ethical leadership. And I think in one of the first conversations I had with the museum, I'm pretty sure I said something to the effect of, I'm here to help the museum, become a superhero, to become a
Yes,
rock
you
star.
literally did say that.
Yeah, and I can tell you I'm not sure if I said it or if I really was meaning that or if I thought it was just the right thing to say. But I think when you look at our process and you look at what the public reaction has been, I think that was right. I think that the museum had demonstrated, ethical leadership in a way that I think a lot of people are really hungry and thirsty for today. And my hope is that the museum, has felt that it got a lot more than it gave up in working with me and Drake's descendants.
Yeah, and on the receiving end of that superhero behavior are the descendants, right? They benefit from this work. So tell me a little bit if you, I mean, I know that you've worked with them. What has this moment meant for the descendants of the Drake family, of David Drake? How, I mean, we've seen some quotes from them and in the articles, but in working with them, what has this meant for them?
Yeah.
I guess another question, Pete,
Yeah.
did they know that David Drake was their descendant? Or did they find out through like this process?
Uh, so they found out within the last decade. There was a genealogist who was working on a family tree for David Drake and reached out and contacted them and suggested that they may be descendants of David Drake, and subsequently the family and I retained the services of a genealogy, and we confirmed that. But let me answer your first question, like how have they received this? And it's not any exaggeration to say that it has been life altering and life defining for the family to discover that they are descendants of David Drake and then to be on this journey. And I want to mention a couple of things. Um, so they didn't know until the last decade that they were descendants of David Drake. And I want to go back to and maybe Tori can go to the slide with the poem. You know, Drake, when he was at his he had three owners, three enslavers owned David Drake, and I believe it was his second owner who sold off his family, who sold his wife and children. It's thought or it's believed, um, uh, you know, separated the family, and it's believed that Dave never saw his family again, never saw his wife or his children again. And he wrote the first line of this poem on this jar. I wonder where is all my relation. He's looking for his family, right? He's looking for his family, and for his family, 175 years later, to discover him is almost a full circle reading of this line. I'll mention something else that was important to the family. Look, I want to be clear, like ethical restitution is not without its complications, right? And I think Tori and I are on this call and we're talking to you about ethical restitution as if it's kind of should be super obvious to everyone that it's always the right thing to do. And look, I'll be clear, that's generally my view, but as an attorney and as an art lawyer and as someone who cares about legacy, there are some aspects of restitution that they haven't bothered me, but I've always wondered, like, is there a better can we do better? And let me give two examples. In the majority of ethical restitution art cases, a family, Nazi looted art, family will make a claim. And in a lot of cases, that's the last time the public gets to see that artwork. That's actually not true. The public gets to see that artwork one more time, and that's when the artwork is sold at Sotheby's, right? The artwork comes off the museum wall and it goes to the auction block. And at that point, it's acquired by a wealthy collector, and typically it's not enjoyed by the public anymore. That always, that felt, I was curious if we could do better. And so one of the attributes that you'll notice, not only with the transaction with Museum of Fine Art Boston, but in the other museums that the family and I are approaching, is in every instance, we are inviting the museum to return the work to the family. And if the museum agrees, we're also extending the invitation to the museum to reacquire the work so it remains in the public space. It's important to the family that the family has no interest in these jars, coming in their living room and sitting on their mantles. They want these jars in the public space so that people can learn from them and be educated and explore their ideas of like justice and morality and ethics. So that's one kind of, we talk about hey, we're just doing the same thing that the museum had done before, but we really did something different. There's one other thing I'll point out, and this is, you had asked about the family, and I want to share how impressed and moved and motivated I was throughout the process and continue to be throughout the process of working with the family by their grace and their dignity and their sense of justice. The other issue you see frequently in cases of ethical restitution is there's typically two lawsuits. There's a lawsuit where the family sues the museum, and then the family gets the museum back. And then the second lawsuit is among the family members because somebody wants to sell it and somebody wants to hold it, somebody wants to donate it, somebody wants to, and again, it's very common. And I always felt like, I wonder if there's an improvement to that. And so, unlike a lot of cases of ethical restitution where the artwork comes back to the family and you immediately see an effort to like make the as few slices in the pie as possible, the Drake family has done the exact opposite here. As soon as they got the jars back from Boston, we launched a public website, descendantsofdave.org, where we're inviting anyone who thinks that they might be descendants of David Drake to come forward, um, and provide a genealogical report. We've got some DNA testing that we can do with other family members, and if it's established that yes, in fact, you're a descendant, then you become part of this trust entity that we've created, and you become a benefit. So again, kind of like looking at how ethical restitution had been done in the past that some people might object to as problematic, and showing that look, and showing what we can do in a different context. That makes me very proud as an attorney that the very first time you've got principles of ethical restitution applied to artwork created by African Americans, by enslaved African Americans, you see that coupled with these these principles of maintaining public access, and not making the slices of the pie fewer.
Thank you so
And
much.
honestly, I think for the museum, that made a huge difference in terms of indemnification. And like, there's always someone that says, well, what if someone else comes forward in 5 years? Then what is the museum going to do? And in this case, we were just like, well, George is on top of that. Like, that's not something that we are going to have to worry about. So that, I thought that had a lot of foresight.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I did want to open it up a little bit for Q&A if you all don't mind. So folks can either put their questions in the chat or just raise your hand or just come off of mute and ask any question that you might have.
Tori, boy, did the time go by quickly. I thought we weren't going to have enough to say. I'm looking now, there's only 8 minutes left. So.
That's when you start talking and you get quite carried away. And like, I could give like a whole lecture on like the history of art restitution, but I won't.
Awesome. Deborah, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Tori and George. So informative and so encouraging. I'm wondering, I think I heard it said that David Drake's work was held all over the place in a lot of other museums. And I was wondering, did Boston MFA set a precedent for kind of how to do it right? And I mean, did it just snowball?
Tori, do you mind if I respond to, or at least do the
No,
initial
that's
response to
fine.
this?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I did mention that there's about 24 museums in the United States that currently hold Drake's jars. No question, Boston Museum of Fine Arts Boston set a precedent as a result of, and here's something I should say, like, you all should be very proud of that institution in your community and its leadership and its trustees. I'm in conversations with several other museums who are not responding the way that Boston responded. So Boston has absolutely set the precedent. What's been beautiful is the Boston's actions, were covered in national media. And as a result of that media coverage, it's been very beautiful. To date, we've had 3 private collectors contact me or reach out to the family and offer to return jars in their collection. And these are individuals, we would have never found these folks, right? They've got these are private individuals, but they read what Boston did. They read about the family and they know what's right to do. And so we're in the process of receiving those jars back. We're also in conversations. There's also several museums who are in the process of hopefully following Boston's leadership here. And this is work that I'm committed to doing. This is work that the family's committed to. And it's also I think the way that we're approaching this with museums, we're creating an opportunity to show leadership. I just did a post on my LinkedIn that there was some legislation passed that I wanted to talk about, and it was a line. It was something to effect of, museums for the longest time have been kind of known as the keepers of things that have value. And we're at a moment now where I think museums have the opportunity to not just be keepers of things of value, but to actually be beacons of values themselves. And so I think it's going to be very exciting and very interesting to see which museums, rise to the occasion and accept that opportunity to demonstrate the moral and ethical leadership that the museum in Boston did.
Thank you. Can I just add one thing? Thank you very much for that, George. But just to be clear, we were very, very aware that we were working sort of unilaterally on this. In other words, we had a very conscious discussion about whether we wanted to work with other museums on this or not. And we ultimately decided not to. I mean, I think if we had tried to work with other museums, we would still be like trying to schedule the first Zoom call. Like it would never have gone anywhere. But what that means is that, you're taking kind of a leap of faith, and we had no idea how this would be perceived. And we didn't make the decision we did for PR reasons. We try to make the best decisions for our institution, but the field of art restitution is a very contentious and oftentimes very ugly field, and we did not know what the reaction to this was going to be, and it was overwhelmingly positive. I don't even think there was, even in the Boston Globe comment section, it was all good. So it was really rewarding to see at the end that, in fact, we weren't doing it for the public support, but there was a lot of public support.
I made this comment earlier. I think the public's hungry to see institutions that we're supposed to trust, like, do the right thing and stand for principles and stand for, our values. And so I think we needed to see Boston do that, Tori. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, it was the right thing for our institution to do. I know that.
Appreciate that. Anyone else with any? Stephen?
Hi, this is fantastic. I think the symbology of the restitution is just over the top. I also wonder, from a not monetary point of view, if there is anything really significant for the family.
I don't want to make light of the financial benefit to the family. It's not their primary motivation, but it's important because, and what they've committed to is they've committed to using any funds that they're able to generate through the sales back to the museum to fund two things, essentially: to fund higher education for David Drake's descendants, and to fund, acquisition of, like, home ownership, acquisition of property, because those are two things David Drake never had the ability to do. He never had the ability to go to school, even though he's clearly very intelligent and educated, and to own property. I don't want to make light of the financial component of this, but for the family, this is about something that is a lot bigger than the money. The piece about the money is that you've got galleries and private collectors and auction houses and, yes, museums benefiting financially from this artwork, which I think can be viewed as a continuation of the institution of slavery. It's like everybody's getting the benefit from this except for the person who made it and his descendants. And so it's more that aspect of having the opportunity to participate as financial beneficiaries. But beyond that, the family is committed to making sure these jars not just stay in the public space, but they actually want to make sure that they're moved around the country. Right now, they're concentrated kind of in the Southeast, as you can imagine. There's places in the Midwest. The family's going to work to get jars at museums in the Midwest, on the West Coast, and so that people all across the country can have access to this. They're also committed to storytelling, telling David Drake's story in ways that conform, like you know education in public schools and that. So yeah.
Appreciate that. And we're just at 6 o'clock. I don't know if Tori and George, if you're willing to stay on for one last question, if
Yeah,
there's
I'm okay.
one last question. Thank you, Stephen, for yours. Alan?
So I was interested to know, you mentioned that there were perhaps 2 dozen works in museums elsewhere. What is the Tori, what is the MFA's how much of the rest of your collection has works by enslaved artists? Do you have a sense at this point?
That's a very good question, because that was another thing that we were challenged to think through, that I was challenged to think through again when you get up in front of the trustees. And I'm not just using them as a like, we really do have to get up in front of the trustees and convince them. One question, as it should be, is like, what kind of precedent does this set for us internally? And I think, whenever there's a sort of new art restitution issue, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction like, oh, this is going to open the floodgates. And it never does. What sets these vessels apart is that we know the artist's name, first of all. I mean, we know that there are other things in the museum's collection that were probably or almost certainly made with enslaved labor. We may never know who those artists were. And some of the provenance that comes with these works of art, it's anecdotal, like maybe it's been passed down within a family for generation that, oh yes, well, this was made, these andirons, we have some andirons. So these andirons were supposed to have been made by, an enslaved artisan. Like, how do you prove that today? So here we know very specifically who the artist was, and we know the artist's descendants. So it's possible that we'll learn more about what's in the collection, but this is really a unique case.
Interesting.
One of the, I'll just add to that. Like, no question, there was a ton of art created by enslaved African Americans. There were drawings and paintings and quilt and fabric work. This is a stoneware jar with an alkaline glaze that was fired in a kiln, and if it's got anything, it's got durability. And so there's not a lot of artwork that because none of the artwork was preserved initially, so it was kind of sent around. It's really only something like this or some metal work that would have been able to be preserved. And then you add on that the fact that Mr. Drake exercised his agency by signing the jar, and that and today his work's been discovered, and it's got artistic and cultural and historic value. So I agree with Tori. I think this is a sample size maybe of one.
I think I think there probably are other areas of I don't want to say the art world because that sounds weird, but there are other historical instances of African Americans in the United States living under conditions that deprived them of their property unfairly, not necessarily slavery, but other periods of American history. There was an African American art dealer who I think his family is alleging that he was either forced to sell things at below market value, or there were other kinds of coercive conditions. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were other cases that are in that way analogous to this one come up.
And what comes to mind is again, boy, Boston's like ground zero for this stuff. But what comes to mind are the Louis Agassiz daguerreotypes of the Fenty and get the names right. And those were just returned. I like
and
to
that
think
was
following
going on at the same
MFAs,
time that this was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although we moved a little more quickly than they did. That's been going on for a decade. But
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
All right. I want to be mindful of time. I want to thank our guests for sharing their perspective and for answering all of these questions and for giving us more insight. I especially appreciate learning more about how this work has impacted the descendants and what this means for how we even think at King's Chapel about our descendant engagement as we do that work. But I'm going to stop spotlighting you.
I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. So as we come to a close, I want to return to where we began. The story of David Drake is not just a story about art. It is about resistance, which we see in how he wrote his name and how he wrote the poems. It's also about it's not just about voice and memory and what it means to be seen. It really is about how we think about this work across generations. And as George mentioned, his work has survived over centuries. His name was carried forward over centuries. His words still speak. What we've heard tonight is that repair is possible, not abstractly, but concretely, intentionally, and in relationship. The return of his pottery from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston to his descendants is not the end of the story, as we've heard from George. There will be a lot more seeking to repair with other institutions. It really is a beginning, and it also sets a precedent and a reorientation for how we think about this work. It's a shift in what institutions believe is their responsibility and what they're willing to do about it. And at King's Chapel, through the Living Memorial, we are asking similar questions. What does it mean to tell the truth about our past? What is required to repair harm, not symbolically, but materially and relationally? And how do we stay in that work over time? So tonight reminds us that this work is not about perfection. It is about courage, the courage to look honestly, the courage to act differently, and the courage to remain in relationship as we do all of this important work. So if returning art is possible, then so too is returning dignity, restoring connection, and reimagining what justice can look like in our time. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all for being part of this conversation. Have a good night, all.
Yes, thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sean.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Ordinary.